That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Those words are etched into history, a symbol of humanity's greatest adventure. The image of an astronaut on a desolate, alien world feels like the peak of human exploration. But what if the real reason for this historic moment wasn't some noble quest for scientific knowledge, but a high-stakes political gamble to crush a rival superpower? This is the story of how the moon landing was cooked up, not as a mission of discovery, but as the final move in a Cold War checkmate. For decades, we've been told a heroic story of scientific curiosity. But declassified memos, private White House recordings, and the intense political pressure of the time tell a very different story. They show that the official narrative is only half the picture. The race to the moon wasn't just about exploring new frontiers. It was about winning a war for ideological supremacy right here on Earth. The Apollo program began as a way for America to prove its technological, economic, and political system was superior to communism. To understand why we really went to the moon, we can't just look to the stars. We have to look at the fear, paranoia, and raw ambition that defined the Cold War. The Soviet threat. To really get the desperation that fueled the Apollo program, you have to go back to a single moment that sent a shockwave of fear through America. October 4th, 1957. On that day, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the world's first artificial satellite. As this small, 184-pound metal ball circled the Earth, its simple beep, beep, was broadcast across the globe. It wasn't just a radio signal. It was a declaration. It announced that the Soviet Union, a nation many in the West saw as technologically behind, had just taken the lead in the new frontier of space. The reaction in the United States was pure hysteria. The Sputnik crisis kicked off a period of intense public anxiety about a technological gap between the U.S. and the USSR. This wasn't just about being second place. The same rocket that put a satellite in orbit could also launch a nuclear warhead across continents, making America's ocean defenses totally obsolete. The fear was real. The Soviets had shown what they could do, and by extension, claimed their communist system was superior. For the first time, many Americans felt vulnerable and truly feared the Cold War could be lost. The media poured gasoline on the fire, with some journalists exaggerating the danger. Science fiction author Arthur C. Clarke even said that the day Sputnik orbited the Earth, the U.S. became a second-rate power. This sense of crisis pushed the American government to act. In July 1958, President Eisenhower created NASA to get the nation's space efforts in order. But the humiliation was far from over. The Soviets kept scoring a stunning series of firsts. They sent the first animal, a dog named Laika, into orbit. They were the first to hit the moon with a probe, and the first to see its hidden far side. They were always one step ahead. But the biggest blow landed on April 12, 1961. On that day, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space, orbiting the Earth in his Vostok 1 capsule. Gagarin's 108-minute flight was a massive achievement and a huge propaganda win for the Soviet Union. Premier Nikita Khrushchev boasted it was undeniable proof that communism was superior. For the United States, it was another crushing defeat that demanded a response. Just 5 days later, the U.S.-backed Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba failed spectacularly, making America look even weaker. The pressure on the new president, John F. Kennedy, was immense. The U.S. was losing the space race, which meant it looked like it was losing the Cold War. Something big had to be done. A new contest had to be chosen, one so bold and difficult that the winner would be undisputed. The political gamble right after Yuri Gagarin's flight, the White House was in crisis mode. President Kennedy, who had only been in office for 3 months, saw it as a direct threat to American prestige. On April 20th, 1961, he shot a memo to Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson, telling him to find a space program which promises dramatic results in which we could win. The goal was simple: find a race America could win, and win big. Kennedy wasn't some lifelong space nut. His interest was purely political. This is crystal clear in now public White House recordings. In a November 1962 meeting with NASA Administrator James Webb, Kennedy's singular focus is obvious. Webb was pushing for a broader, more scientific space program, but Kennedy cut him off. "This is, whether we like it or not, a race," Kennedy said. "Everything that we do ought to really be tied in to getting onto the moon ahead of the Russians." He was brutally honest about his motives, admitting, "I'm not that interested in space. The only reason to approve the fantastic expenditures that would wreck our budget," as he put it, was simple: because we hope to beat them. The point wasn't just to get to the moon. It was to prove that America could start from behind and still blow past its rival. This raw political calculation was the birth of the Apollo program. The moon was chosen not for its scientific value, but for its strategic value. It was a goal so huge, so far beyond what anyone had done, that it basically reset the entire race. It created a new finish line that America, with its massive industrial and economic power, had a chance to reach first. With that, Kennedy went before Congress on May 25, 1961. His speech is now famous, but it's important to see it in its original context. He presented it as a matter of urgent national needs. This wasn't just a hopeful speech about the future. It was a Cold War call to arms. "I believe this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth," Kennedy announced. He framed it as a battle for freedom itself, saying, "No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind, ... and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish." The price tag was insane. Kennedy asked for what would become one of the largest resource mobilizations for a single peacetime project in history. At its peak, the Apollo program employed over 400,000 people and involved more than 20,000 companies and universities. The final cost was pegged at over $25 billion at the time, which is well over $250 billion today. Kennedy's gamble was breathtaking. He was committing the nation to an engineering feat that was, frankly, impossible at the time. When he made that speech, the U.S. had a total of 15 minutes of human spaceflight experience. They didn't have a rocket that could get to the moon. They had no idea how to navigate in deep space, how to dock two ships, or how to land on another world. The whole plan was based on pure faith in American ingenuity and the belief that beating the Soviets was a national emergency. From the very beginning, the mission to the moon was a political act, a brilliant and desperate move to win the Cold War. The race to the moon Kennedy's speech fired the starting pistol. The United States government and its people threw themselves into a technological crusade like nothing ever seen before. The Apollo program became a national obsession, and the only thing that mattered was beating the Soviets to the prize. The path to the moon was broken into steps. First came Project Mercury, which was America's frantic game of catch-up, aiming to get an astronaut into orbit. Then came Project Gemini, the often overlooked but critical bridge to Apollo. Gemini's goals were way more ambitious, mastering long-duration space flights, perfecting how to rendezvous and dock two spacecraft, and conducting spacewalks. These weren't just practice runs. They were all essential skills for a lunar mission. But the race had its tragedies. The intense pressure to meet Kennedy's deadline led to taking huge risks. On January 27, 1967, a fire broke out inside the Apollo 1 command module during a ground test. Astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee were killed in the blaze. The disaster was a brutal reminder of the dangers involved and a direct result of the program's frantic pace. It forced NASA to fix series design flaws and create new safety rules, a painful but necessary pause. Meanwhile, the Soviet lunar program was a state secret. While NASA's missions were on TV for the world to see, the Kremlin's work was hidden. This was a double-edged sword. It hid their failures, but it also meant they couldn't celebrate their successes. They were developing a monster rocket of their own, the N-1, to compete with America's Saturn V. But their program was a mess of infighting, shifting political support after Khrushchev was ousted, and a huge blow in 1966 with the death of their genius chief designer, Sergei Korolev. All 4 test launches of the N-1 rocket ended in massive explosions, killing any chance of a Soviet on the moon. As the Soviets stumbled, the American program hit its stride. In December 1968, Apollo 8 scored a massive psychological win. Astronauts Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders became the first humans to orbit the moon. On Christmas Eve, they sent back images of the lunar surface and the iconic Earthrise photo to a spellbound world. The U's had spectacularly taken the lead. The next 2 missions, Apollo 9 and 10, were full dress rehearsals, testing the lunar module in both Earth and lunar orbit. By the summer of 1969, everything was ready. A decade of non-stop work, incredible spending, and heartbreaking sacrifice had led to this. The political bet made by a young president was about to pay off on the dusty plains of the Sea of Tranquility. The giant leap. On July 16, 1969, the monstrous Saturn V rocket roared to life in Florida. On board Apollo 11 were 3 men carrying the hopes of a nation: Commander Neil Armstrong, Lunar Module Pilot Buzz Aldrin, and Command Module Pilot Michael Collins. 4 days later, on July 20th, the world held its breath as Armstrong and Aldrin in the lunar module, the Eagle, made their descent. An estimated 600 million people, the largest TV audience in history at the time, were glued to their screens. It was a moment that went beyond borders and politics. When Armstrong's voice crackled over the speakers, "Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." A wave of relief and joy swept across the globe. A few hours later, Neil Armstrong climbed down the ladder and became the first person to step on another world. His famous words, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," were chosen to sound universal. But everyone knew it had a double meaning. It was a leap for humanity, sure, but it was also the final winning step in a bitter 10-year race. The United States had won. The global reaction was electric. President Richard Nixon called it the greatest week in the history of the world since the creation. The moon landing cemented America's place as a global superpower, a stunning display of what its democratic system could do. It was the ultimate soft power move, designed to win over neutral countries in the Cold War. In the Soviet Union, the official reaction was polite but quiet. Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin sent a message of congratulations. In public, the state-run media buried the story, claiming they were more focused on robotic missions. In private, they were devastated. They had tracked the mission and knew it was real. As one journalist later wrote, "When they did overtake us, we had to maintain secrecy so that no one knew that we had been overtaken." For years, the USSR flat out denied there had ever been a moon race, a lie they didn't admit to until 1989. The mission was a complete success. Armstrong and Aldrin spent over 2 hours on the surface, setting up experiments and collecting 47.5 pounds, 21.5 kilograms, of lunar rocks and soil. But the science, while important, was a bonus. The main prize was planting the American flag on the moon, a symbolic act of victory. The United States had answered Kennedy's challenge and proven its dominance in the most dramatic way possible. The gamble had worked. The story of Apollo shows that history is never simple. It's a mix of high ideals and cynical politics, of pure science and raw ambition. If this deeper look into one of humanity's greatest achievements grabs you, be sure to subscribe and ring the bell for more documentaries that peel back the layers of history. And let us know in the comments. Does knowing the political reasons behind the moon landing change how you see it? So, was the moon landing only to beat the Soviets? The evidence is overwhelming that this was the main reason. Without the threat and national humiliation from the early Soviet space wins, it's almost certain the U.S. wouldn't have spent the fortune needed to land a man on the moon in the 1960s. President Kennedy's own private words confirm it. The program was born out of a desire for a political victory. But to say it was only about the Cold War ignores its massive legacy. The Apollo program gave us incredible new science, completely changing our understanding of the moon and the solar system. The 842 pounds of moon rocks brought back across all Apollo missions are still being studied by scientists today. The program also sparked huge leaps in technology, from computers to materials science, that have become part of our everyday lives. Maybe one of its biggest impacts was cultural. Those stunning photos of Earth, the Earthrise, and blue marble, a fragile blue and white swirl in the blackness of space, helped kickstart the modern environmental movement. For the first time, we saw our planet not as an infinite world, but as a single delicate home. And in a final ironic twist, the very program born from a bitter rivalry eventually led to cooperation. The Apollo-Soyuz test project in 1975 saw an American and Soviet spacecraft dock in orbit with the crews shaking hands in space. This symbolic moment marked a thaw in the Cold War and set the stage for future partnerships like the International Space Station. So, while the race to the moon started as a desperate Cold War gamble, its legacy grew into something much more. It was a political act that led to a transcendent human achievement. It proves that our greatest leaps often come from complex and even contradictory motives. The race to the moon may have been a battle in the Cold War, but the journey itself now belongs to all of us.